Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The House on the Hill. When I was a teenager, my town had a legend everyone knew. An old, abandoned house on top of a hill surrounded by dense forests. They said that decades ago, an entire family vanished there without a trace, and that anyone who tried to live in the house fled within days, terrified. I always thought these stories were nonsense. After all, they were just exaggerated tales to scare kids, or so I thought. One October night during school break, my friends and I decided to prove the legend false. They dared me to spend a night alone in the house. Not wanting to seem like a coward, I accepted the challenge. I climbed the hill at sunset, carrying a backpack with a flashlight, food, a blanket, and my phone. The house was even more terrifying up close. Its windows were shattered, the paint had completely peeled off, and the front door hung on a rusty hinge. It felt like the house was watching me. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt an unusual chill, like the air inside was colder than outside. The smell was unbearable, a mix of mold and something I couldn't identify. The silence was absolute. The only sound was my own footsteps echoing on the rotting wooden floor. I explored the rooms downstairs with my flashlight. There were old, dusty furniture pieces, and the wallpaper was faded and torn in places. I found an old grandfather clock, its hands frozen at 3:15. I decided to stay in the main room by the fireplace, where I set up a makeshift camp. The first hour was uneventful. I ate a snack, scrolled through my phone, and tried to ignore the shadows that seemed darker than they should have been. Around 11 p.m., things began to change. First, I heard footsteps upstairs. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I turned on my flashlight and cautiously climbed the stairs, calling out, "Is someone there?" My voice echoed through the house, but there was no response. The upstairs hallway was narrow, with doors on either side. All were closed except for one at the end, which swayed slightly as if someone had just walked through it. My heart raced, but I forced myself to continue. When I pushed the door open, I found an empty room. There was a rusty iron bed and a chair against the wall. It looked ordinary except for one thing. The chair faced the window, but in the reflection of the glass, it appeared to be facing me. I swallowed hard and quickly left the room. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard a sound. It was a whisper, faint and indistinct, but it seemed to come from every direction at once. I started down the stairs, but when I reached the bottom step, I saw something that made me freeze. The front door, which I had left ajar, was now completely shut, with handprints imprinted in the dust. The once extinguished fireplace now glowed with a faint blue flame. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I was no longer alone. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen was completely black, as if the battery had died, even though it had been fully charged when I arrived. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to sound brave. There was no answer. But then the grandfather clock began to chime. The sound reverberated through the house, each chime louder than the last. I looked at the clock, and it now read exactly 3:15, the same time it had been frozen at. Suddenly, the flame in the fireplace went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. My flashlight began to flicker erratically. In the brief flashes of light, I saw something in the corner of the room, a tall, dark figure with faintly glowing eyes. It stood motionless, but the pressure in the room was unbearable, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. My courage evaporated. I ran to the front door, desperately trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. The silence returned, but it felt even more menacing. Then I felt something touch my shoulder. It wasn't a light touch. It was cold, firm, as if an invisible hand was trying to stop me from leaving. With a burst of panic, I threw myself against the door with all my strength. It creaked open, and I tumbled out onto the damp grass of the hill. I looked back, gasping for air, and saw the house cloaked in darkness once again. Everything seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. But at the last second, a light flickered on in one of the upstairs windows, and I swear I saw the same figure watching me. I never went back to that house. My friends laughed and said I was making it up, but I know what I saw, what I felt. The house isn't empty, and whenever I pass by the hill, I feel as if something is still watching me, waiting for me to return. Story 2, the Hotel of Mirrors. I travel a lot for work, and because of that, I've stayed in hundreds of hotels. Some are simple, others luxurious, but nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to the experience I had at an old hotel in the countryside. I don't know why I decided to stay there that night. It was small, isolated, and had a gloomy atmosphere that made me uncomfortable from the start. Now, I know I should have trusted my instincts and left. I arrived at the hotel in the late afternoon. The reception was modest, with old furniture and a worn carpet. The receptionist, a tired-looking older man, greeted me with a polite smile, but it seemed forced. He handed me the key and said something strange. Room 307 is special. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call me. I carried my suitcase to the third floor, and as I walked down the hallway, I felt something peculiar. The silence was absolute. There were no signs of other guests, or at least it seemed that way. I heard no voices, no footsteps, no sounds at all, except for the creaking of the floor beneath me. When I reached the room, the door was oddly heavy, as if it resisted being opened. The room was simple, but one thing immediately caught my attention. A massive mirror covering almost the entire wall opposite the bed. It was old, with an ornate gold frame, and the glass seemed slightly foggy, as if it held the reflections of others who had stayed there before. A chill ran through me as I unpacked my things, but I forced myself to ignore it. It was just a mirror after all. The first hour was uneventful. I ate a light meal I had brought with me and went to bed early, planning to rest for the next day's commitments. But around midnight something happened. I woke up suddenly with no apparent reason. A feeling of unease washed over me. The room was freezing, much colder than it should have been. I looked at the mirror, and that's when I noticed. My reflection was wrong. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But when I shifted in bed, I realized that my image in the mirror wasn't moving in sync with me. My movements were slightly delayed, as if the reflection was acting on its own. I froze, trying to make sense of what was happening, but then I saw something even worse. There was a figure standing behind me in the reflection. I spun around quickly, but the room was empty. Fear began to creep in, but I tried to convince myself that I was just tired. I lay back down and closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. The room felt heavy, oppressive, as though something was watching me. It wasn't long before I heard the first sound. A faint scratching, like nails scraping against glass, coming from the mirror. I grabbed my phone and shone its light onto the mirror's surface. There was nothing there. But when I turned off the light, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The mirror now showed several figures, blurry and motionless, standing around the bed. They had no defined faces, just dark forms like human shadows. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me, and all I could do was stare. One of them moved closer. In the reflection, I saw its hand reaching toward me. When I felt something cold touch my arm, I screamed. I leapt out of bed and ran out of the room without looking back. In the hallway, the silence was absolute, but the cold seemed to follow me. I ran down the stairs to the reception. The receptionist, as if he had been expecting me, looked at me calmly and said, "Room 307 isn't for everyone." I begged for another room or any place to stay for the rest of the night, but he just shook his head and said all the rooms were occupied. Grabbing my things hastily, I left the hotel and drove for hours until I found another place to stay. The next day, I returned to the hotel to retrieve something I had forgotten, only to find ruins. The building had been abandoned for decades. What happened that night still haunts me. To this day, I avoid mirrors in unfamiliar places, because sometimes I feel like those figures are still there, waiting to be seen again. Story 3, the Abandoned Hospital. I've always enjoyed exploring abandoned places. Something about walking through forgotten spaces, full of history and mystery, fascinated me. That's how, during a trip to the countryside, I heard about an old psychiatric hospital that had been shut down decades ago. People said the place was haunted, that the screams of patients could still be heard at night. Of course, I didn't believe it. I decided to explore the place alone. It was the biggest mistake of my life. I arrived at the hospital in the late afternoon. The building was enormous, a worn concrete structure with broken windows and a facade covered in moss. The main gate had fallen, and tall grass obscured the path leading to the entrance. As soon as I stepped inside, the air changed. The smell of dust, dampness, and something metallic, perhaps rust or dried blood, was suffocating. In the lobby, the silence was absolute. Cracked and peeling tile floors reflected the dim light filtering through the windows. Near the reception desk, there were rusted metal chairs and an overturned stretcher. It looked like the place had been abandoned in a hurry. I turned on my flashlight and started exploring. The hallways were long, dark, and maze-like. Doors were slightly ajar, revealing rooms with old beds and wheelchairs covered in dust. Some had papers scattered on the floor, medical records, old prescriptions. I picked up a few and shivered as I read descriptions of horrific treatments. Lobotomies, electroshock therapy, physical restraints. It felt like the walls were saturated with the pain of those who had been there. In the third hallway, I heard the first sound. It was a faint creak like something moving slowly. I thought it might be the wind, but the sound grew louder. I moved toward the source and saw something that made me stop. A wheelchair at the end of the hallway was moving on its own, creaking as it slowly turned to face me. My heart raced. I swung the flashlight around, but there was no one there. It must be the wind, I murmured to myself, trying not to panic. I continued exploring, but now the hospital felt alive. The air grew heavier and I felt like I was being watched. On the second floor, I found an old cafeteria. Tables and chairs were covered in dust, and broken plates were scattered across the floor. Then I noticed something on the wall, handprints. They were small, like those of children, but fresh, as if someone had just made them. Suddenly I heard laughter. It wasn't normal laughter. It was low, distorted, as if it were being played on an old tape recorder. It echoed through the cafeteria, sending chills down my spine. My flashlight flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, I saw shadows darting around me. Is someone there? I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the creak of a door in the adjacent hallway. I decided to leave the cafeteria and follow the sound, even though every fiber of my being begged me to run. The hallway led to a room with a sign that read, Special Treatment Ward. The door was open, but it seemed to beckon me. I stepped in cautiously, shining my light around. The room was large and cold, with rusted stretchers in the center and old cabinets lining the walls. On one of the stretchers, there was something covered by a sheet that resembled the shape of a human body. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. With trembling hands, I lifted the sheet. There was nothing there. I sighed in relief, but it didn't last. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft sound like a sigh coming from behind me. I looked back at the sheet, and it was moving as if something was underneath it. Before I could react, I felt something cold touch my arm. I ran. I fled the room as fast as I could, but the hospital seemed to be changing. Hallways that had been straight now twisted into a labyrinth. Doors slammed shut on their own, and footsteps echoed around me, but I saw no one. Finally, I found a staircase leading to the ground floor and sprinted toward the exit. When I reached the lobby, I heard one final sound that chilled me to the bone. A low voice, almost a whisper, calling my name. I didn't look back. I ran out of the hospital and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove for hours before I could stop and catch my breath. When I told some people in the town about what happened, they looked at me with horror and said no one should ever enter that hospital. Since that night, I've had constant nightmares. In my dreams, I'm lost in the hallways, hearing laughter and footsteps that I can never find. And sometimes I wake up with the feeling that someone is standing beside my bed watching me. Story 4, The Farm of Lament. I've always been a skeptic. I never believed in ghost stories or cursed places and would laugh at anyone who talked about such things. That was until I had to spend some time at an old farm in the countryside to take care of some work. A friend, the owner of the property, asked me to oversee the place while he dealt with some issues in the city. It was a simple house, surrounded by abandoned fields and dense woods. It seemed peaceful, at least until the sun went down. I arrived at the farm at dusk. The house was massive but older than I had expected. The windows were narrow and dusty, and the roof was partially covered with moss. When I stepped inside, I immediately felt a sense of oppression. The air was cold, even in the summer heat, and the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the wind against the house's wooden walls. I spent the first day organizing a few things and getting used to the place. However, the atmosphere felt heavy. Old portraits adorned the walls, depicting what I assumed were the house's previous owners. The eyes in the paintings seemed to follow me, but I forced myself to ignore it. It was just an illusion, I thought. At night, I prepared a simple dinner and settled in the living room. The fireplace was lit, but it didn't warm the room. It was as if the cold emanated from the walls themselves. Around 10 p.m., I heard the first sound, a faint knocking coming from somewhere in the house. I assumed it was the wind and continued reading. But then another knock came, louder and closer. I decided to investigate and followed the sound to the main hallway. It seemed to come from a door at the end, which I hadn't explored yet. The door was locked with an old padlock. As I approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The knocking stopped as soon as I touched the doorknob. I decided it was best to leave it alone for the night. I returned to the living room, but the discomfort grew. The silence became deeper, almost deafening. The fire crackled irregularly, and the shadows it cast on the walls seemed to shift unnaturally, as if something else was shaping them. I tried to ignore it, but when I glanced at one of the portraits, my heart stopped. The figure in the painting, which had been looking straight ahead before, now seemed to be staring directly at me. I jumped up and went to the bedroom, deciding it was best to sleep and end the day. I locked the door and lay down. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last long. I woke up in the middle of the night, around 3 a.m., with a distinct feeling that someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and saw that the bedroom door, which I had locked, was now open. I tried turning on the light, but the switch didn't work. I grabbed the flashlight beside the bed and shone it around the room. There was no one there. But when I pointed it down the hallway, I saw something. A silhouette. Tall, dark, standing at the end of the corridor. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me. Frozen with fear, I shut the door again and pressed my back against it, trying to listen. Slow footsteps began to echo, pacing back and forth in the hallway. I stayed like that for hours, too terrified to move. When dawn finally broke, I opened the door to find the hallway empty. But the padlock on the locked door at the end of the corridor was broken. I decided I needed to see what was inside. The room appeared to be an improvised basement, filled with old objects. Cracked porcelain dolls, furniture covered in dust, and a massive mirror in the corner. But what caught my attention the most was a notebook left on a table. Its pages were filled with frantic notes, as if someone had written them in desperation. The phrases repeated over and over: "They watch me. They call me. There's no escape." As I read, I felt an intense chill behind me. I turned to the mirror and saw my reflection. But I wasn't alone. A dark figure stood behind me, with glowing eyes and an outstretched hand, almost touching my shoulder. When I turned around, nothing was there, but the mirror still showed the figure. I ran. I grabbed my things and fled the house without looking back. I called my friend, trying to explain what had happened, but he just sighed and said, "I knew I shouldn't have asked you to stay there. The house has a history. No one lasts long in it." I never returned to that farm. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, I hear knocking at my door, as if something is still trying to find me. Story 5. The Basement School. When I was a child, my town had many scary stories, but none were as well known as the tale of the old primary school in the center. It had been closed down decades earlier after a fire destroyed part of the building. What remained was an abandoned, soot-covered structure that the locals avoided. However, the scariest story was about the school's basement. People said something terrible had happened there, something that changed anyone who entered forever. My friends and I were curious and, like most kids, loved challenges. One day, while we were playing, someone suggested exploring the abandoned school. At the time, we were about 12 years old and fearless, or so we thought. We decided to go in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. I brought a flashlight and a backpack with some essentials, thinking it would be just a silly adventure. When we arrived, the school was even gloomier than I had imagined. Its windows were broken, and parts of the collapsed roof let in beams of light that illuminated clouds of dust floating in the air. The walls were covered with graffiti and soot stains. The main door creaked loudly as we pushed it open, almost as if warning us not to go further. We explored the upper floors first. There were overturned desks, burned notebooks, and shattered blackboards. Everything seemed normal for an abandoned building. But when we descended to the ground floor, things began to change. The air was colder, and the silence was so deep it was almost deafening. One of my friends, Joao, noticed the door beside the staircase leading down. "It's the basement," he said with a nervous grin. "I bet no one else has had the guts to go in there." The door was locked with an old padlock, but we managed to break it using a metal rod we found in the hallway. When the door opened, a strong smell of mold and something metallic filled the air. The basement was dark, and the only light came from our flashlights. The concrete stairs spiraled downward, and each step felt heavier, as if something was pulling us further in. At the bottom, we found a long hallway with doors on both sides, each marked with hand-painted numbers. Some were open, others shut tight. We entered the first room and found what appeared to be a storage area. Old boxes, broken toys, and what looked like a small chalkboard in the corner. It seemed normal until we heard the first sound. It was a faint laugh like that of a child, coming from one of the rooms farther down the hallway. We froze, exchanging terrified glances. There was no way anyone else could be there. Even so, we decided to investigate. As we approached, the sound grew louder until it abruptly stopped. When we entered the room, it was empty except for a single desk in the center. On it lay an open notebook. The cover was burned, but the pages inside were intact. We began to read, and what we saw made our skin crawl. Repetitive phrases written in childish handwriting. "They come at night. Don't look. Don't answer." Joao picked up the notebook, but the moment he did, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. One of my friend's flashlights flickered out, plunging us into near total darkness. That's when we heard footsteps in the hallway. They were quick and light like children running. We shone our flashlights toward the door, but no one was there. "Let's get out of here," I whispered, my voice trembling. As we ran back down the hallway, we noticed that the doors to the other rooms were now open. Inside each one, we could see shadows standing still, motionless. They looked like human figures but lacked any details. We didn't stop to look closer. We sprinted up the stairs as fast as we could, but the sound of footsteps followed us. It felt like something was chasing us. When we finally reached the school's entrance, the main door was shut. We tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge, as if it were locked from the inside. While we struggled, I heard a whisper behind me, soft and almost inaudible. "Don't go." We finally forced the door open and ran until we were far enough away to catch our breath. When we looked back, we saw a shadow in the basement window. It was small, like that of a child, watching us. We never went back to that school. A few weeks later, I heard that the building had been demolished. But sometimes at night, I still hear faint laughter when I'm alone, and I always wonder if something from that school followed me home. Story 6. The Forgotten Church. My grandmother always said there are places where the sacred and the profane meet, and that it's best not to meddle with things we don't understand. I never paid much attention to these stories until the day I stepped into an old, abandoned church hidden deep in the forest surrounding our town. It was a place everyone avoided, but in my youthful curiosity, I decided to investigate. It was autumn, and the trees around the church were almost bare, their dead leaves carpeting the ground like rust-colored velvet. The structure was partially covered in moss, with broken stained glass windows and a crumbling tower that looked ready to collapse. The front door was ajar, as if inviting me in. The interior was dark, with a strong scent of rotting wood and something metallic, blood, perhaps. The fading light of the evening filtered through the shattered windows, casting beams across rows of dusty pews. The altar stood at the far end, still intact, with a crooked cross perched on top. But what drew my attention most was a sound. It was a low murmur, almost like a prayer, coming from somewhere near the altar. I held my flashlight tightly and approached cautiously. As I got closer, I noticed markings on the floor, scratched as if with something sharp. They resembled symbols, interwoven circles, and lines that made no sense. On the center of the altar lay an old book, its pages yellowed and bound in worn leather. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The pages were filled with words written in a language I didn't recognize. Some appeared to be names, others symbols that matched the markings on the floor. As I flipped through the book, the murmuring grew louder, as though something or someone was standing right beside me. I shone my flashlight around, but there was no one there. Then I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was the creak of a pew being dragged. I turned the flashlight toward the back of the church and saw something that made my heart stop. One of the pews was moving slowly as if being pushed by an unseen force, but there was no one there. I decided it was time to leave, but when I turned around, the door I had entered through was now closed. I ran to it, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. My breathing grew heavy, and the murmuring now seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and louder. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing across the wooden floor. I aimed the flashlight down the central aisle, and there it was. A figure. It was tall, draped in a dark cloak that covered its entire body. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me. When I pointed the flashlight directly at it, the figure took a step toward me. The murmuring stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even worse. Without thinking, I ran to the altar and hid behind it. The sound of footsteps continued, closer now, each one echoing as if it were right above me. I tried not to breathe, but I could feel the icy air around me, as if something unseen was drawing nearer. Then I heard a voice. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, raspy, and it felt as if it were coming from inside my head. I tried to scream, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. I glanced up and saw something reflected in the broken mirror behind the altar. The dark cloak was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the book, now closed, and the floor markings, which seemed to glow faintly as if they had been freshly carved. Suddenly, the door burst open with a loud crash, letting in a blast of cold wind. I ran outside without looking back, tripping over tree roots until I reached the road. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I heard one last thing, the sound of the church bell ringing, echoing through the forest. The problem was, the bell had been broken for decades and no one was supposed to be there to ring it. Story 7. The Cemetery of Mist. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories and haunted tales. So when a friend dared me to spend a night in the old town cemetery, I accepted without hesitation. The place was infamous for legends of people hearing voices, seeing shadowy figures, or feeling strange presences. But to me, it was just a cemetery, a quiet, uneventful place. At least that's what I thought until that night. I arrived at the cemetery around 10 p.m. It was a cold and foggy night, with the full moon hidden behind thick clouds. The rusty iron gate creaked at the slightest touch. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt an unexpected chill, one that wasn't just from the cold. The place felt heavy, as if the air itself were denser. The moss-covered gravestones and the twisted shadows cast by the surrounding trees only added to the eerie atmosphere. I chose a spot near an old mausoleum to settle down. I brought a flashlight, a blanket, and my phone, thinking I'd watch something to pass the time. At first, everything was calm. The only sounds were the wind rustling the trees and the occasional distant howl of an animal. I began to relax, laughing at how ridiculous the whole idea seemed. Around midnight, the fog grew thicker. It became difficult to see more than a few meters ahead, even with the flashlight. That's when I heard the first sound. It was a whisper, faint and almost indistinguishable, coming from somewhere near the mausoleum. I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized there were words. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the voice sounded feminine, soft, yet filled with anguish. I stood up, shining my flashlight around. There was nothing, just the gravestones and the mist that seemed to shift on its own. The whisper stopped, only to be replaced by footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and circling around me. I tried to speak, but my voice came out weak. I decided it was better to stay silent and observe. As I turned back to my spot, something caught my eye. One of the gravestones had a name that seemed familiar. I approached it for a closer look and felt a chill run down my spine as I read it. It was my name. My mind raced to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Perhaps someone with the same name was buried here. But then I noticed something even stranger. The date of birth on the stone was exactly the same as mine. My breathing grew shallow and my heart began to pound. The whisper returned, louder now, and I turned my flashlight behind me. In the midst of the fog, I saw a figure. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, and seemed to hover above the ground. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze fixed on me. "Who's there?" I managed to say, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began moving slowly toward me. I froze for a moment, but as it drew closer, panic set in and I ran. I ran without looking back, tripping over roots and gravestones as I searched for the gate. The fog seemed thicker, almost as if it were trying to swallow me whole. I could hear footsteps behind me, accompanied by low, raspy breaths. Finally, I spotted the gate and sprinted toward it with everything I had. As I crossed through, the oppressive sensation lifted. I turned back, and the cemetery was still and silent once more, as if nothing had happened. The figure was gone, but the whisper lingered in my mind. In the days that followed, I tried to forget what had happened, but I couldn't. Sometimes at night, I hear footsteps outside my house, slow and deliberate like the ones I heard in the cemetery. One night, I woke up to something even more unsettling. A handprint on my bedroom window made of condensed mist. Since then, I avoid cemeteries, especially at night. But I can't shake the feeling that wherever I go, that figure is still following me, waiting. Story 8. The Asylum of Whispers. When I began working as a photographer of abandoned places, I knew I'd encounter strange locations and unsettling stories. But nothing I had visited could have prepared me for the St. Marianne Asylum, an isolated building in a forgotten small town. Closed for over 50 years, the asylum was infamous for stories of mistreatment and patient disappearances. People said the screams of the inmates still echoed through its walls. I arrived at the site in the late afternoon, eager to capture unique images. The building's facade was imposing yet decayed, with broken windows and iron beams corroded by time. The main entrance was overgrown with vines, but the door was partially ajar, as if inviting me inside. As I crossed the threshold, the air turned cold and heavy, as if the asylum itself were alive. The main hall was vast and dim, with peeling walls and old furniture scattered across the floor. The silence was so profound that my footsteps echoed through the entire building. I took a few photos of the lobby before heading into the main corridor. There were several numbered doors, all open, revealing small, empty rooms. Except for one. Room 17's door was slightly ajar, and something about it caught my attention. As I approached, I noticed scratch marks on the wood, as if someone had clawed at it from the inside. I cautiously entered the room and saw a rusted bed frame and a chair propped against the wall. On the floor lay pieces of yellowed paper. I picked one up, and a chill ran down my spine as I read, "They whisper when the sun sets. Don't listen." I thought it might be a prank or part of some old document, but I decided to leave the room anyway. I continued exploring the building, climbing the stairs to the second floor. The corridor there was different. The walls were stained dark, and the smell of mold was stronger. I snapped a few photos before hearing a faint sound. It was a whisper, soft and distant, like a muffled conversation. I shone my flashlight down the hallway, but there was no one. The sound grew louder, now seeming to come from every direction. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal, but as I ventured deeper, the whisper began to form words. It wasn't a language I recognized, but it sounded urgent, almost pleading. I reached a larger room that must have been the patient's common area. Chairs were scattered, tables were broken, and a dusty piano stood in the corner. As I approached the piano, I noticed fingerprints on its keys, as if someone had recently played it. Suddenly, a low, drawn-out note sounded, followed by another and another, forming a slow, haunting melody. The piano was playing by itself. I froze, but when the melody stopped, I heard something worse: laughter. It was soft, childlike, and seemed to come from within the room. I swung my flashlight around, searching for the source, but there was no one. Just shadows that seemed to move along the walls. I decided it was time to leave. I retraced my steps down the hallway, but it felt longer than before. The doors that had been open were now shut, each emitting muffled sounds, moans, laughter, or scratching. I began to run, but just before I reached the stairs, I saw something that made me stop abruptly. At the end of the corridor stood a dark figure. It was tall, with a thin, distorted body and eyes that glowed faintly. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze. The figure took a step toward me, and the entire hallway seemed to tremble. The whispers became deafening, morphing into distorted screams. I bolted down the stairs, stumbling and nearly falling until I reached the lobby. The door I had entered through was shut, and when I tried to open it, it felt locked from the inside. The whispers were all around me now, and I felt something cold brush against me like an invisible hand. I turned, and there it was again, closer this time. With all my strength, I pushed against the door, which finally gave way. I ran outside, tripping over branches and rocks until I reached my car. When I looked back, the asylum was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. But in one of the second-floor windows, the figure stood, watching me. When I developed the photos a few days later, most appeared normal, except one. In the photo of the second-floor corridor, a strange shadow loomed in the background, exactly where I had first seen the figure. Since that day, I've avoided abandoned places. But sometimes at night, I still hear whispers, especially when I'm alone. Story 9, The Mountain Inn. When I decided to take a solo vacation, I wanted peace and tranquility. I chose an inn in a small mountain village, an isolated place surrounded by dense forest. The website described it as a charming building with a few rooms and a cozy fireplace in the main lounge. But when I arrived, it didn't look quite like the photos. The inn was weathered and worn. The wooden walls were darkened with age, and moss crept up the exterior beams. The owner, a pale, elderly woman, greeted me with a strange, almost forced smile. She handed me the key and, before I went up to my room, said something that made me uneasy. At night, stay in your room. Some things prefer the darkness. I assumed it was a way of encouraging privacy for other guests, but her tone was too serious for a simple courtesy. I went to my room and unpacked, trying to ignore the strange feeling the inn gave me. The room was simple but clean, with a bed, a small table, and an old mirror hanging on the wall. On the first night, I sat by the fireplace in the lounge, reading a book as the fire crackled softly. The inn felt empty, even though the owner had mentioned there were other guests. I heard no voices, no footsteps, and saw no one. I went to bed early, exhausted from the trip, but I woke in the middle of the night. The room was freezing, and the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. That's when I heard the first sound. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, coming from the hallway outside. I got up and opened the door slowly, shining my phone's flashlight into the corridor. It was empty. But at the far end of the hallway, a door was slightly ajar. I didn't remember seeing it open before. I decided to go back to my room, but before I could close the door, I heard something else. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. I convinced myself it was another guest. I returned to bed and closed my eyes, but the sound grew louder, as if the footsteps were now in the hallway just outside my door. My heart began to race as I heard the doorknob turn. But the door was locked. Is someone there? I asked, my voice trembling. Silence was the only reply. After a few minutes, the footsteps receded. When I finally fell asleep, I had strange dreams. I saw a tall man with pale skin and black eyes standing at the foot of my bed. He didn't speak, he just watched me. The next morning, I asked the owner if there were other guests at the inn. She shook her head and replied calmly, "No, you're the only one." A chill ran down my spine. If I was the only guest, then who had been in the hallway the night before? I decided not to press further, but was determined not to spend another night there. I packed my things and went to the reception desk, but the owner was nowhere to be found. The phone didn't work and there was no cell service. Outside, the mountain weather had worsened and a snowstorm was beginning to fall. I had no choice but to stay another night. This time, I decided to remain in my room as the owner had suggested. Around 11 p.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time they were faster, like someone running down the hallway. The doorknob rattled violently, banging against the wood. I grabbed my phone to shine a light, but the battery died, plunging the room into darkness. That's when I saw something in the mirror. A tall figure with black eyes was reflected there, even though the room was empty. It moved closer to the reflection of the bed, and I could feel the air around me grow colder. My body was frozen with fear, unable to move. When I looked directly at the mirror, I saw its mouth move. It whispered something I couldn't understand, but it sounded like a threat. Suddenly, the door to my room burst open, letting in the icy wind of the storm. The figure vanished, but the terror lingered. I ran out of the inn without looking back, stumbling through the snow until I found a path leading back to the village. The next day, I returned to retrieve my belongings, but the inn looked different. The windows were shattered and the front door was boarded up. When I asked the villagers about it, they said the inn had been abandoned for years. They avoided speaking about the place, but one phrase was repeated by everyone: "Some souls never leave the mountains." Since that day, I've sworn off staying in isolated inns. And at night, when I catch my reflection, I sometimes feel like something is still watching me. Story 10. The House on Black Lake. I've always felt a deep connection to nature. As a child, my family often spent vacations in remote cabins near lakes or forests. So, when I had the chance to rent a house by a secluded lake for a weekend alone, it seemed like the perfect escape. The description boasted a charming home surrounded by trees and offering stunning lake views. The price was great and the photos looked amazing. I arrived at dusk and the reality didn't quite match the pictures. The house was more weathered than I'd expected, with worn boards and windows clouded by years of dust. The lake, which was supposed to be the main attraction, was dark and reflective, like a grim mirror. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint whisper of wind through the trees. The first thing I noticed upon entering the house was the smell of mildew, as if no one had been there for a long time. The main room was simple, with old furniture and an unlit fireplace. I went upstairs to the bedroom, unpacked my bags, and tried to shake off the eerie feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. It was strange. There wasn't another soul for miles, yet the sensation lingered. That first night, as I ate dinner in the living room, I heard a noise outside. It was a faint splashing, as if something were moving through the water. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped onto the porch to investigate, but there was nothing. The lake was still, so motionless it seemed almost solid. Shaking my head, I went back inside and locked the door, dismissing it as my imagination. Later, as I tried to sleep, I woke to a clearer sound: footsteps. Slow but deliberate, as if someone were walking around the house. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and looked out the window. There was nothing to see, but the feeling of being watched intensified. My gaze drifted to the lake, and I swear I saw something move on its surface. It was a dark shape, indistinct, disappearing into the mist before I could make it out. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the house to calm my nerves. That's when I found something that set me on edge: tracks near the lake's edge. They looked like footprints but were far too large to be human, with long toes ending in claw-like points. There were several of them, all leading into the water and vanishing there. I decided it would be best to cut my stay short, but I wanted to make the most of the daylight first. Around noon, I sat on the porch with a book. The sound of the wind and rustling leaves was almost soothing, but something felt off. I looked toward the lake and saw it. At first, just the top of a head emerged. The skin was pale, almost translucent, with a texture like wet leather. Then, two large, pupil-less eyes appeared, faintly glowing in the daylight. The creature wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. It stayed at the water's edge, watching me. When I tried to stand, it slowly sank back beneath the surface. That night, the real terror began. I woke to a loud noise, something banging against the outside walls of the house. I ran to turn on the light, but it flickered and almost went out. Another sound came, this time from the front door. It was a scratching, as if something was clawing at the wood, trying to get inside. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, I retreated to the bedroom and locked the door. Then I heard a whisper. It wasn't human. It was deep, gurgling, like a voice carried from underwater. The words were incomprehensible, but they sounded like a summons. The doorknob began to turn slowly, and the air in the room grew icy. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Gathering my courage, I opened the door. The living room was flooded. The water was perfectly still, reflecting my face back at me. But something was wrong. In the reflection, another figure stood behind me, tall, with glowing eyes and long claws. I turned around, but the room was empty. The reflection, however, remained, grinning. I fled the house that night, driving without stopping until I reached the nearest town. When I called the owner to explain what had happened, he only chuckled. "You saw them too, didn't you? They don't like intruders at the lake." I never went back. To this day, I avoid places near lakes. But sometimes at night, when I'm alone, I hear that same gurgling whisper, as if the lake is still calling for me. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next terror.